Welcome back to the Alex Jones Show. I'm David Knight filling in for Alex, and I've got in the studio with me Anthony Gucciardi from StoryLeak, and he's got an interesting story to go over with us. 3 disturbing Fukushima facts that the government is covering up. Tell us about that, Anthony.
So it's funny that we don't trust the NSA. You know, we go over there and try to give them a little bit of a check and balance. They throw us out and say we're crazy.
Yeah.
Why should we trust the government when it comes to a radiological explosion event like the mega disaster of Fukushima?
Yeah.
I mean, they say it's safe. They say it's perfectly great. Everything's fine. Everything's happy. The Japanese officials have been caught time and time again admitting on record they lied about the levels. They downplayed it. They ignored it.
Well, their meters didn't even go up to the max. They weren't even capable of recording what the radiation was. We find out now that it's like 18 times higher than they said. Well, that's tremendous.
They turned the counters off.
Yeah.
They don't want you to know. And my whole
right.
thing is, this thing is bigger than we even thought. And it's coming out more and more because even I thought, you know, even researching this, that 2011, 2012, that's where the massive amount of radiation was coming from. You know, we're dealing with those effects. Potentially, they're going to try and take the rods out and make it explode again sometime soon, maybe this month or the next. But it's even worse than I thought. In September, last September, it was found that the radiation levels were skyrocketing and spiking to highest amounts on record.
Yeah, this is going on now for well over 2 years.
Yeah.
And it just keeps going and going and going. This is a story that just, they still don't have this under control. It's still right on a razor's edge.
Yeah, so let's be clear. It did not peak in 2011, 2012. It's getting worse.
Yes.
And they don't even know how to deal with it. They accidentally turned off the power. I mean, this is such a mismanagement on a scale that makes me think it's not even possible to handle it so improperly. It's unbelievable what's going on. Let's look back specifically as well as to what happened with all the radioactive cesium and everything like that. Most people think it just kind of went into the air and disappeared, or maybe a little bit went into the ocean. 20%, according to independent research, TEPCO later had to admit this, 20% went on Japanese land and started killing people there. 2% went on foreign lands just from this initial release. 78%, according to this independent research, was just massively funneled into the Pacific Ocean. And that's why you have fish with 258 times the quote-unquote safe allowable levels of radiation coming in, and people are eating it, and they don't even know.
And they just had another release of more radiation. Of course, they said, oh, don't worry about it. It's low level. But then they kind of rolled that story back and said, well, there was, for a couple hours, it was really high, but then we got that down. So it just keeps going and going because they've got these massive tanks that have highly radioactive water that is from the original disaster. And they see that that's leaking down into the ground. So they're going to build this incredibly expensive ice wall to try to contain that because it's leaked down into the groundwater there.
It sounds like a cartoon idea.
Yeah.
It's just Looney Tunes.
Yeah.
And then you look, even Huffington Post now, an article, it's a good article called Fukushima Forever, basically says it's just going to leak forever into the ocean. And what are we going to do about it? And people are told from the news that regurgitates the government diarrhea of information that nothing's wrong. Everything's fine. You know, it's conspiracy now, even though Facebook in Japan is blowing up with all these people getting radiation sickness, and we could talk about that, the nosebleeds. They're not only saying that's crazy and you're a conspiracy theorist if you talk about it, but they're saying that those people are literally insane.
Yeah, that's a story that we have on InfoWars from Natural News. Japanese doctors ordered to cover up mass radiation sickness across the population. That's the nosebleeds that they see happening now. People are complaining about that on Facebook, and the government's response is, move along, there's nothing to see here. This is something, though, that doesn't just affect people in Japan. It's also people in the U.S., of course, that have some exposure to this because it's polluting the ocean, the fish, as well as the prevailing westerly winds. When Chernobyl happened, you had a tremendous amount of exposure to people in Western Europe because of prevailing westerlies. We're going to see the same sort of thing happening here if there's a major disaster when they try to take these nuclear fuel rods out.
Well, we're already seeing it here because they found hot particles as far as Boston. San Francisco, the soil samples, they found particles as well. So it's already happening, and just one of those particles, talk to any of the experts. You inhale one of those particles, it's bad news. It's pretty much game over. The cancer might come later at a later point, but just one of those hot particles is horrible, and we're seeing them come across as far as Boston. I mean, for the people that are saying that the Fukushima disaster has nothing to do with the United States, they're deluding themselves. It's a complete insanity that they're saying that. And that's why I'm writing articles like this. We're talking about this to get this out, because the establishment will just brick wall it every single time because it's such a big, hot issue. If people actually knew about it, we would freak out, and rightfully so. So that's why they ignore it and downplay it. And then the media, you know what the media does with things like the NSA or the TSA, they take what the government says and they spin it even more. Well, imagine the government saying that Fukushima is great and amazing. The media spins it further and then says it's a conspiracy theorist to even say radiation is bad, pretty much.
Right.
There was figures saying that radiation is good.
Yeah, and Coulter, yeah.
Yeah, low-level radiation is great when, in fact, low-level can actually harm you more than a lot because of the way the body works. Just a little bit of something can, in some ways, like a microchip, kind of destroy everything as opposed to a large amount.
But you can't see it, you can't feel it, you can't taste it. You don't see an immediate effect. This is something that, as you pointed out, is a long-term reaction. It's an increase in the number of cancers, and they can come back and say, well, gee, we don't really know where that came from.
And there was a
5 years, 10 years. Yeah, exactly. So this is something that the government doesn't want to alarm people about, and they don't really care. They're not going to look out for our health. We certainly know that. We can see that from the way they allow GMO and other things into our food supply that we also know have long-term subtle side effects. But this really is tremendous. The spent reactor fuel that's there is 85 times the radioactivity that was released at Chernobyl. So we have a lot of potential exposure to that. And as you were pointing out before, they're going to do something now with the fuel rods. They're actually going to try to get these down.
Yeah, exactly. They're going to do a precise surgical operation that some of the experts say is over a 90% chance is going to fail. And what that could mean is another explosion at Fukushima. You know, even though there's been countless already, we don't even know the true number. It could be another one coming in the very near future. And
they're going to try to pull these things out, and they're possibly bent or damaged because there's been this earthquake there.
Of course, yeah.
So they've got to pull these things out without touching each other. There's like over 1,000 of them there.
The same people that accidentally turned the power off.
Yeah.
You know, the same people that want to build an ice wall around the plant instead of actually addressing the issue. And, of course, the same people that said, actually, yeah, the radiation emitted from the initial explosion was not that much. And then they were continuing to lie until an independent review came, an independent scientific review, and said it was not only 2.5 times more radiation initially, but that, of course, they were dumping it in the Pacific Ocean on purpose. And then TEPCO came and said, yeah, we were going to tell you about that. You know, our readings were a little bit off, but somehow independent scientists on a low budget managed to find the exact readings and exactly where the cesium and radioactive material was going. So TEPCO is a bunch of liars, and they want to...
It's a large corporation.
Of course.
That's looking out for their corporate profits.
It's like this. It's if Monsanto owned a nuclear power plant. That's how much we can trust these people.
Right. That's right. Very much like that. Yeah, the former head of the NRC, is Dr. Yakso, has said that continuing to put a Band-Aid on a Band-Aid is not going to fix the problem of Fukushima. And he's pointed out that the nuclear power plants here in the U.S. essentially share the same design flaw. And GE and other companies who made this reactor have gone through, and they've had the Japanese government, the Canadian government sign these essentially waivers, releasing them from any liability for this. But he's pointed out that they all have this fundamental design flaw that you've got to keep these cooling power sources continuously going no matter what happens, whether it's a terrorist attack or whether it's an earthquake or a flood or a tornado or a hurricane. Those backup power plants have to keep going and keep it cooling because these spent fuel reactors, these spent fuel pools are just as dangerous as the reactor. So just as we saw with 3 Mile Island and Chernobyl, we saw reactors that blew up. Now the public is starting to realize that the spent fuel is just as dangerous, and it's going to be there for thousands of years as well.
That's exactly right. And when I talk to these nuclear experts, what amazes me the most is what they say off air, what they tell me in emails, basically that the whole system is beyond fixable almost. I mean, it is. There's ways to do it right with nuclear power. There are, but they're not doing it right. That's why 3 out of 4, or up to 90% of every single nuclear power plant in the United States right now is leaking. Every single one. And Obama wants to put dozens more on the East Coast.
Oh, yeah, that's his favorite source of power is nuclear. He thinks that's the greenest thing out there.
They're not just putting Band-Aids on things. They're just making the problem worse. They're making more Fukushimas. They're not even trying to bandage it.
It's just amazing to me that they can portray carbon dioxide, which every animal, every human breathes out, and that plants use just like we use oxygen. They can portray that as the most dangerous thing on Earth. And yet, when you look at the most dangerous thing on Earth, these highly radioactive spent fuel pools and these nuclear reactors, they tell us just the opposite. They tell us that's the greenest thing on Earth.
No. You don't understand. CO2 is evil.
Yeah.
Sustainable clean coal is evil. But actual radiation and nuclear energy from power plants that are leaking 90% across the United States and Fukushima and Chernobyl, that's all really good. And radiation doesn't hurt you.
Yeah.
But CO2 will kill you.
It reminds me, they had this story, When the Wind Blows, and they made it into an animated story back in Britain. It was a British animated film back in the 80s. And it was this couple who was kind of fuddy-duddy, and there was a nuclear accident or nuclear war. Anyway, there was a lot of nuclear fallout headed toward them, and they just innocently read the government pamphlets about what they were to do. And it was just total baloney. It was like sticking your head in the desk